now.
Greetings and welcome to our Hangout for today. My name is Gordon Feller. It's the last day of May in 2017. I'm here in San Francisco and we want to welcome you to this special event, a 1-hour webinar with Michel Burr. Let me introduce our organizer here, the World Smart City Forum. This is an organization that was established, rather I should say perhaps a project that was established jointly by the International Electrotechnical Commission in Geneva and two of the UN agencies who are also based in Geneva, the International Standards Organization and the International Telecommunications Union. Those three organizations are collaborating to bring you this event and a forum which is available at worldsmartcity.org. I'd encourage you to go to that website after our 1-hour session today to learn more about the programs, about the blogging that's taking place on that site. There's a concept paper you can find there that explains the underlying ideas behind World Smart City Forum. But allow me now to tell you a little bit about how we're going to conduct the 1-hour session today. As your moderator, I'm being helped by Sylvia in London, and she and I will be looking at your questions that you'll be asking during the course of the hour. Some of those questions you'll provide us via Twitter, and you can tweet us anytime from any device at twitter.com/worldsmartcity. We would encourage you to consider, questions that you think are the most interesting and relevant, and we'll try to get to those questions and comments. Or if you don't have a Twitter account, you can join us at facebook.com/worldsmartcity. You'll see, among other things on that Twitter feed and on the Facebook feed, an announcement that we've made about the World Standards Day program, which is inviting you to consider your proposed design for the poster. The premise of the World Smart Cities Forum is the same premise as World Standards Day 2017, which is that standards, global, open, secure standards make cities smarter and help improve the efficiency of cities. And so you can find out more details at worldsmartcity.org about that, but also at the Twitter account WSD Contest. So let me introduce our special guest today and tell you about why we've invited him to speak on the subject. The title of his presentation is Public-Private Partnerships and Community Energy and Microgrids, P3 Community Energy and Microgrids, Aligning Interests for Local Sustainability and Resilience. Michel is joining us from his office in the United States, where he serves as the president and founder of the Microgrids Institute, which is probably, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Institute, the leading organization promoting and developing and initiating and coordinating multidisciplinary work that addresses all the various factors that affect the development and operation of energy microgrids. He's produced more than 20 volumes of energy industry journals. He's moderated countless public events and workshops and some of the formative industry initiatives that are designed to accelerate the adoption of advanced technologies. He's had 25 years of industry experience that led to the founding of the Microgrid Institute. He began his career on the editorial staff of Independent Energy magazine and at the Independent Energy Forum, which was focused on the independent power producer industry. And then in the early 90s, he served as communications director for the National Independent Energy Producers Association, and then continued his work as an independent analyst with clients like IBM and Barclays and PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And then he switched to another publisher, Penwell, who some of you know, Electric Light and Power magazine, and then at Inside Council magazine. Continued his publishing at Public Utilities Reports in 2001, and then for 7 years, from 2007 to April 2014, he served as editor-in-chief of Public Utilities Fortnightly. So you can see he spent a lot of his years getting very rigorous about understanding the future of the energy industry and how it's evolving and changing, and that led him to form Microgrids Institute. So Michel, thank you again for joining us today, and I'm turning the floor to you And I should tell everybody that the slides will be available after this event. You can see this event on a continuing basis on our YouTube channel, and we will certainly be continuing to debate the future of microgrids after today. So Michael, the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Great, thank you very much, Gordon. I really appreciate that introduction. It's really helpful. Great background. It's fun to hear about sort of my life story in a couple of minutes. And indeed, it's been an interesting 25 years leading up to the launch of Microgrid Institute. I sort of feel like I got my start in this industry in the disruptive side of the industry in the independent power development business. And it took another 20 years almost for that to turn into what it is today, which is really disruption at the edge of the grid instead of just at the power plant level. So it's been an interesting experience for sure. I'm just going to dive directly into my presentation here today. So I'm going to switch the window over so we can all share a view of that presentation. So you should at this point be able to see the title slide. Is that what everybody's seeing now? P3 Energy, Community Energy, and Microgrids. I'll just go ahead. So basically want to provide a little bit more background on Microgrid Institute. I think Gordon did a great job with the introduction, but I'll fill in a couple of other details. We'll talk about what we mean by microgrids. Depending on who you talk to, you might get a very different definition. So we'll talk about what some of the definitions are and what that implies. Then we'll move into the new area of the market, which is community energy microgrids, and we'll talk about what some of the developments are in that space and some of the challenges and ultimately lessons learned from recent efforts to develop community microgrids. And I should mention community energy and microgrids is a little broader term. We're not specifically only talking about microgrids, but it serves as a good kind of platform for the conversation and for development in the community of a community-focused energy strategy. Just a bit more background about Microgrid Institute. We've got a few active projects in development right now, community energy and microgrid projects, that is. A couple of them are in upstate New York and also one in Maryland. The project in Maryland actually today is officially the last day of the DOE project contract under which we've been working on that project. So some continued effort will move on after this, but it's an interesting milestone actually that we're having this call today on the last day of the DOE contract for the only town center microgrid. So other than that, you can see a number of other initiatives that we've been involved with. Basically, as Gordon said, taking a look at some of the factors that affect microgrid development and what are some solutions to try and overcome the challenges that face efforts to develop microgrids and ultimately distributed energy systems. You'll note that the last item on this list here is Microgrid Finance Group. That is actually a new allied organization that we've launched as a Delaware LLC. We won't be talking a lot about that today or about microgrid financing in general. I do have one slide on it. We'll touch on a couple of sources of financing for community energy projects and some of the challenges to accessing that. But basically just wanted to mention what that's all about. Microgrid Finance Group is a startup organization that's seeking to help find pathways forward for community energy projects and microgrids in particular to get commercial financing. We'll talk a little more about that later in terms of what I mean by commercial financing and what that need is. So now on to the definitions portion of the presentation. Talking about microgrids always raises the question of what is a microgrid? What do we mean by a microgrid? And basically the definition that most people in the market use, it comes down to a system that's capable of operating in isolation from the utility grid. So in other words, it's able to safely island itself during a grid event, an outage of some kind. Or maybe it's not connected to a grid at all. It may be simply a remote system or on an island in a body of water. So it's literally always an island of some sort. But generally, that's one of the key differentiating factors of a microgrid. Additionally, when we talk about advanced microgrids that people tend to be focused on today, we're talking about systems that manage multiple sources of energy supply. So that may be multiple renewable energy systems or renewables combined with a combined heat and power system, for example, and usually energy storage of some form, usually batteries. And that's all managed by a single system. And that differentiates it from a backup power supply system. Typically a backup generator is turned on and connected only to serve very specific loads during a specific time period, and there's not much control of anything that's happening during that service. A microgrid is something that's more intelligent and active than that. It actively has to manage multiple sources of supply to maintain a balanced system. It can and often does also manage loads to keep them balanced against the supply so that loads aren't overloading the available supply or that you don't experience blackouts within the microgrid. That's the overall general definition that we tend to use when we're talking about a microgrid. It can use really any fuel, so it's not like it has to be a renewable energy system or, there's not too much to restrict what a microgrid can be other than what I just said. When we talk about community microgrids, that typically means that we're talking about a microgrid that provides sustainable energy for a community, however you define community. Usually in the United States, when we talk about a community microgrid, we're talking about a municipality, a city environment of some sort, at some size, and the microgrid is serving loads on multiple sides of a public street and often serving multiple customers. So those are some things that differentiate a community microgrid from other types of microgrids. And we'll talk a bit more about some other types of microgrids too. But first, I just wanted to, bring this slide up and show, how a microgrid really is an actively managing system, that it monitors the overall balance of the system. And then if something goes awry, like for example, in this slide is showing that the grid is lost in an outage scenario, then it needs to take action in order to keep the system balanced. So it will isolate itself from the grid to avoid unintentionally feeding power onto the grid, and then it will take action internally, increasing supply and reducing load if possible in order to keep the system balanced. And normally a microgrid is designed to serve certain critical loads, and so those would be seen as highest priority. And there may be some loads that are optional or that can be shed if necessary in order to enable the system to stay balanced, even if supply isn't sufficient during some period of time to serve the peak load. As I mentioned, there's a few different types of microgrids. They all meet the definitions that I talked about, but they can be very different in terms of complexity and in terms of their purpose. One thing that we tend to say is that a microgrid is whatever the customer wants it to be. And that's a bit of a joke because we want to try and actually keep a definition that makes sense. But on the other hand, really a microgrid is a custom system that is designed intentionally to meet the specific needs of a specific set of customers. And that differentiates a microgrid from the grid, from the macrogrid, which supplies a generic service to all customers, or practically that's what it's intending to do. So that means that there are different types of microgrids to serve different types of purposes. When we talk about a campus microgrid, that's typically literally a campus environment, whether it's a college or university or a corporate campus or a government, campus of government buildings. Military bases meet the same kind of definition, where it's all basically on one plot of land, and generally speaking, it's only serving one bill-paying customer. That's the simpler type of microgrid. Other types of microgrids that I mentioned already include island microgrids or remote village microgrids. And then we get into community microgrids that can include multiple different types of communities. I wanted to specifically mention this concept of a multifamily housing microgrid, the last item in that bullet point on the bottom. some multifamily housing developments you could look upon as a community, and microgrids can be particularly important for them, especially if they contain vulnerable populations that have limited mobility or that experience particular economic or other hardships in the case of a utility outage. So we'll keep moving ahead here and just talk about a public-private partnership as opposed to other approaches to microgrid development and ownership. I think public-private partnerships are well understood in many countries around the world. They're probably a little better understood in the international market than they are in the United States, because P3s have been used very effectively around the world in locations that require major infrastructure additions, but that don't necessarily have a lot of cash to fund those kinds of investments. A public-private partnership has been used effectively to bring commercial capital into major infrastructure projects like water projects, roads, bridges, that type of thing, to make it possible to finance those types of investments, and to include the expertise and capabilities of major multinational contractors to get those jobs done. The P3 or public-private partnership approach is now being adapted in the community energy space to be a methodology and a framework for making decisions, for one thing, and also investments in community energy infrastructure. And that can take many different forms, but in each case, what we have is a combination of public entities, whether it's a municipality or a county or some other local entity, or even the state or federal or national government, together with some private partners, whether they be private investors or private contractors, to plan and move forward with a project on a partnership basis. And that's the basis on which we're working on a couple of our projects. The ones that I mentioned in upstate New York are both public-private partnerships. So most of the lessons learned and challenges that I'm talking about here today are drawn from those experiences, as well as others that our colleagues have had in other types of projects in other settings. When we talk about community energy development and how a microgrid fits into that, it really invokes a conversation about many different priorities in a given community. Communities generally think about energy sustainability and resilience projects on a one-off basis. In other words, they think about a microgrid, and then separately they may think about a community solar project, and separately they may think about an electric vehicle infrastructure project. The fact is, all of these projects are very complementary. They all can be planned and implemented together. And it's wise to try to do so, so that the investments that are being made and the plans that are being undertaken really serve the whole aims, the strategic goals of the community, instead of just serving the specific narrow goals of one specific project. So when we speak with communities about community energy and resilience and sustainability, we like to take a step back and not just focus in on a microgrid. I mean, our name is Microgrid Institute, but that doesn't mean that's all we're interested in, or that we're not seeking to help communities to develop other kinds of solutions. What we want to do is help communities to understand that these sorts of solutions should be developed and planned, and if possible, financed and executed in an integrated fashion, so that those investments can, serve and deliver the most value for the community. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but I wanted to just make that point that it's not just about microgrids. It's really about an overall community energy strategy that can come together, and that can include a microgrid as an integral and frankly, a very important part of the whole package. This slide kind of illustrates that point, that a resilient energy system is sort of maybe the top stone in the pyramid, but there's a lot of things underneath it upon it which it can be built, and things that it can serve for the community. And that includes improving resiliency. Obviously, that's one of the key drivers for microgrids in many locations, not all locations, but many locations. In addition to that, a microgrid can serve to increase the use of local renewable energy resources, reduce dependence on imported fuels, or in particular fossil fuels, to reduce dependence on external sources of fuel, as well as reduce the carbon footprint of the community. All of that can also save money for the community in multiple ways by avoiding the costs and disruptions that come with outages, but also by reducing dependence on volatile energy supplies that can go up and down in price pretty dramatically. And it can also serve to keep energy dollars in the community. To the degree a microgrid or community energy system is relying on increasing amounts of energy that are owned locally, then the money that's spent on the output from those energy sources is actually kept in the community, as opposed to going to a fuel company one state or two states away, or across one or two borders. Finally, a microgrid can be part of a system that enables customers to actually get actively involved in the energy system. It can serve and facilitate prosumer behavior, that is, where consumers become producers and actually can actively participate in and contribute resources to the operation of the system. That all comes together in the context of a community energy strategic approach. Oh, looks like I got the same slide in twice. Sorry about that. I'll keep moving ahead. Actually, that segues nicely from that last slide that mistakenly got put in there in that location, because there's really many different approaches to developing microgrids, and we're talking more specifically here about community microgrids. Community microgrids can pose particular challenges in some locations because of the regulatory framework. Basically, in many states in the United States and in many countries around the world, there may be one utility or a monopoly utility that has a franchise to operate in a given service territory, and that if you are trying to provide electricity services to customers, multiple different customers, and where you need to cross public rights of way in particular to serve those customers, that is to cross roads or other rights of way, then you may be treading on the legal territory of the utility. So at the same time, trying to build a community microgrid under the construct of a utility itself can be very challenging, if not impossible in some cases, because the utility often is legally required to provide the same level of service to all of its customers within a given rate class in the United States, or just simply to all customers in some other country jurisdictions. And that requirement really forbids it from setting up a special system for a particular community. Basically, other customers might say, why did they get that and we don't, and why do we have to pay for that kind of investment? Honestly, many utilities aren't all that familiar with or particularly interested in the microgrid concept, because most utility systems are designed and built and operated and financed around a central station operating model, where they've invested a lot of money, billions of dollars over decades, in central generation plants with long distance transmission and distribution systems that deliver that energy to end use customers. And that's the system that makes the most sense within that utility regulatory construct and within the utility history. So trying to develop a microgrid within that kind of a corporate culture and within that type of an engineering environment can be difficult because it's a different and new type of technology that utility engineers and business people aren't really familiar with. Third parties, on the other hand, are eager and interested in deploying those types of technologies and trying to see what they can do and what kind of additional value can be delivered to customers that's unique from the rest of the system. So you can see that a community microgrid is a tricky thing for utilities to develop, unless it's very limited in terms of the community that it's providing and the value it's actually bringing. If a utility is making that investment to only, for example, reduce or defer investments in a substation upgrade, then it's probably not a problem for a utility. But if what they're trying to do is provide additional resilience and new services to a given community, then it's going to conflict probably with their mandate. If they're not, if a utility isn't in support of a microgrid development, then it can be next to impossible to make it happen. So what we're really seeing is that public-private partnerships and hybrid approaches are almost, in many cases, the only way to do a microgrid or to do a community microgrid that really serves a broad range of needs in the community. Basically, there needs to be some partnership between the municipality itself and probably a third-party developer or investor and the utility to make sure that the system will be financeable and that ultimately it can operate within the regulatory boundaries that are set for third parties to make investments. That can involve concessions or agreements with the utility, or it can involve investment by an actual participation of the utility in those portions of the assets that are uniquely owned or can only or best be owned by a regulated utility entity. So I'm going to keep going. We've seen and continue to see certain challenges and opportunities in the public-private partnership area for community energy development. As I mentioned before, one of the things that's really necessary, we feel, for community energy development is integrated planning, so that stakeholders in the community coordinate their efforts, and so that investments in sustainability and resilience assets can be made in a logical way that ultimately is complementary and yields the best value for the community. Additionally, a public-private partnership approach ensures that the focus of those investments are kept on community goals. If the community itself is public part of the P3, which it should be, then it can be continuously in the conversation, ensuring that the steps that it takes, the decisions that entity is making on behalf of the community are consistent with the community's goals. And that's not necessarily true if you don't have a public-private partnership. If a third party or if a utility is going and developing a microgrid on its own, seeking to serve the community, not really in partnership with that community, it's unlikely that that entity is going to really develop a system that will serve a broad range of goals for the community. So additionally, a P3 structure we've found really fosters creativity and a focus on outcomes that can serve a broad range of stakeholders. The P3 groups that we're involved with have multiple parties involved, more than one municipality, and also local other public and private actors in the community. And when you bring them together, it's remarkable to find out just how many different ideas can be brought to the table, how many different plans can be accommodated and brought together into a more robust solution for everybody. That really is a key benefit that comes out of a public-private partnership approach. It also brings in the expertise and financing capabilities of the private sector. So that win-win approach and that creative effort really emerges in that P3 environment. I mentioned, commercial financing. Also, public entities have access to public forms of financing, and that isn't true necessarily for a third party or for a utility. So a P3 can help to enable access to multiple forms of financing. And ultimately, that leads to lower total costs for customers, because with the ability to access multiple forms of financing, the system can get lowest cost financing, the best deal for the project investment. And also, with a focus on community goals, it will enable the project to be developed in a way that really puts cost savings where it belongs in that list of priorities for the community. and to keep it there. Some of the challenges that arise from all of that, however, are that when you get involved with multiple stakeholders and multiple off-takers, that is customers of a project, that just inherently increases the complexity of the deal. And that can make the credit look more challenging, even if it isn't, but often it does just simply make the credit of the overall project or the overall investment less strong. Makes it weaker credit when you have multiple customers involved, because they're not all probably going to bring AAA investment grade credit. One hopes most of them do, and if you don't have an anchor customer that does, then it can be very difficult. But that's definitely a challenge of a P3 approach, where you have multiple stakeholders and multiple customers. Same thing when you have multiple stakeholders. You need to achieve and maintain a state of compromise, and that can be challenging. And jumping to sort of the last bullet point for a moment, that also leads to longer processes that take longer to undertake, just because you're needing to achieve compromise and to understand what can be evolving needs and conflicting or in some ways competing needs of different stakeholders in a partnership. That means that all of the stakeholders need to be patient, and that requires a level of patience that not everybody always brings to an initiative like this. So that's something that needs to be well understood at the outset. Finally, I'm going to go back to that earlier bullet about expanded requirements for compliance and reporting. When you have more than one public entity, for example, different public entities have different regulations that they have to adhere to. And so that kind of increases the administrative burden and some of the regulatory requirements that are involved. Moving ahead to the next slide. Financing sources. That I mentioned earlier, I was just going to include one slide about financing sources. The fact is that community energy projects and microgrids, there is no real cookie cutter or single model that's available to finance these projects. And so depending on where you are in the country or in the world, and what types of entities are involved, what customers are involved in the microgrid, where cash flow is coming from, basically, that's going to affect what sources of financing you can access. In some locations, there are credit guarantee agencies of one type or another that can be very useful, very helpful to get projects financed that otherwise on their own may be too complex to access low-cost commercial financing in the market. Where those types of entities aren't involved, then it's likely that more equity financing is going to be needed, and that it will be difficult to get debt financing in the market. But as a general matter, all of the structures that have been used to finance local distributed energy resource projects and renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects, all of those types of financing sources can be applied for community energy and microgrid systems, but often it takes some creativity and some more administrative work, basically, to put together a financing package for a project that may be kind of small on an investment scale basis. So from a financing perspective, these projects are viewed as fairly novel in the market, or relatively new and not thoroughly understood by sources of financing. And so that, at this point anyway, means that financing is a little more costly than it would be for other types of renewable energy projects, for example, that are much more well understood in the market and represent a simpler business case. Microgrids can be, community microgrids, that is, can be a bit more complex, and they involve the integration of multiple technologies in a way that the banks aren't necessarily familiar with. So it takes some creativity, and that ultimately means a little bit higher cost for microgrids than we're likely to see for other types of better understood projects in the market. So some lessons learned that we'll close with in our presentation. We've learned basically that a microgrid needs to be driven by the community, community microgrid that is, and a community energy project. It needs to be based around a charter and a set of goals, a set of strategic objectives that is determined by the community in partnership with the other members of the P3. And the P3 itself, the administration of the P3, needs to really maintain its focus on those objectives throughout the process. It can be pretty easy, as we say, to get lost in the weeds or to go down a path that doesn't necessarily lead toward the outcome you want. So it's important every step of the way to make sure that everybody understands what the charter objectives are, and then to maintain a focus on those objectives. If they need to change during the course of a project, which sometimes they can, that's fine, but it needs to happen in a collaborative way, and steps need to be taken in a purposeful way that are, reflective of what are serving what the goals are for the initiative or investment to start with. As I mentioned, collaboration among multiple stakeholders really depends on partners that want to cooperate. If you're, really you can't bring a P3 together that involves entities that aren't going to be cooperative. So that's critical. One key thing to think about too is that the authority for a public entity to be involved needs to survive any given administration to the degree possible. And that may not always be the case, but what it really means is it's important to engage the whole community to try and that goes to the last point on this page, really, and that is to ensure that the entire community is on board with and supportive of a project, so that even if administration changes, if the mayor or town council turns over in an election, that the community is still on board, and the new mayor and the new town council is at least not going to oppose the project. It may take some time to bring them up to speed, but really the point is it needs to be perceived as and executed as a project for the community and not just for the individuals that are really at the table at the beginning, because these things take time, and those individuals probably will change in some course during the process. And then finally, that all requires an effective management hand to keep everybody on board and moving toward the same goal. As I mentioned, stakeholder engagement really requires a commitment on the part of the public-private partnership to seek the engagement of the community, to actively communicate and to encourage the community to ask questions, to be open about answering those questions, and to take multiple viewpoints into consideration in the entire P3 development process. That requires a particular skill set around clarity in communicating with a really diverse set of stakeholder groups. When you've got people engaged in a project that have been involved for months, you can speak in shorthand. You can refer to the objectives in a way that they already understand. And in the community, you can't do that. You can never really speak in shorthand when you're talking with members of the community. And that requires a special skill to be able to provide a very top line, but objective and comprehensive overview of a project without losing people in the way and getting really bogged down with a lot of jargon and process-oriented discussions. So that really goes to the efficiency of processes that you undertake, and the real clear effort to engage all members of the community that are going to be affected by the microgrid or that may be interested in it. So also a key to success is to take a multidisciplinary approach. Community energy projects and microgrids, we may think of them as an engineering project essentially, or a construction project, but it's a whole lot more than that. It really goes to regulatory and legal structures, as we talked about a bit earlier. It goes to economic and financial considerations, and the ability to manage the most important risks for the customers that'll be served by the microgrid and for the community as a whole in its energy investments. And ultimately the ability to bring in multiple sectors in the planning process so that we understand for a community what really are the critical assets, what are the critical services and functions, how are they being planned, and how can we make sure that a microgrid or community energy system is consistent with and supportive of those plans and those efforts. It does no good to say that you're going to protect the community's critical assets if you don't, stay in touch with those assets and keep current on what their future plans are, because things change. A fire station that you were planning to serve today may not be there tomorrow. It may move. It may be integrated together with another system. Ongoing integrated discussions need to be happening during every step of the way to ensure that plans that are being made in multiple sectors that are affected can be integrated into the planning process. It may go without saying that a benefit cost analysis is very important. I hope it doesn't go without saying, but we should focus on it. It's really important to understand from a feasibility perspective, not just what can work from a perspective of a science project or an engineering project, but also what can actually work economically and what makes the most sense. When you focus on a community's objectives, and then you think about the most cost-effective and overall beneficial way of serving those objectives, that leads you to a cost-benefit analysis, as opposed to saying, we want to build a microgrid and we want to serve the entire community with it, and then trying to find the cheapest way of doing that. It's better to focus on a cost-benefit analysis of the best way to serve the community's overall objectives. And that means you need to be rigorous and objective and take an open approach, and not really get closely allied at the early stages with a given technology, for example, or a given design approach. It's important to stay open and understand what the multiple possibilities are, so that the most cost-effective ones can rise to the top. That is an iterative process. It doesn't just happen by looking at one possible approach. It makes sense to start with some objectives, think through some ideas, and then to refine those ideas to optimize them for the best outcomes. And then finally, accountability and metrics are really important. There's a saying that you can't improve what you can't measure, and it's very important during an entire process like this that we understand what we're shooting for, what we're aiming to achieve, and then to set metrics, milestones, and approaches, processes to ensure that we're on steady progress toward achieving those goals and meeting the metrics that are set up. That varies widely depending on what you're trying to achieve, but basically it means you need to think through what are your quantitative metrics and what are your goals and how are we going to achieve them, and then be transparent about reporting success and failure and continued work to try and achieve those metrics, and what sort of mitigative efforts need to be put in place where those metrics are, where we fall short of meeting those metrics. Because ultimately it is a process. It's not going to happen all at one time. And we expect changes along the way. And that's what I'll close with in terms of the final message. And this is something that we try and keep in mind in working with public-private partnerships, that this is a process, not a product. We need to look at it as basically a team effort that is an ongoing effort that needs to continue until we achieve the objectives that the Charter has set forth. It's not just about turning out a given product or turning out a given project. It's really about meeting a set of objectives that the members of a public-private partnership come together to set and to pursue in partnership. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Michael. Very helpful, very rich. I would say almost too much of a meal to have at one sitting. It's going to be several meals, I think, for all of us to digest. But let me go into a few of the questions that have arisen and we'll use this as an opportunity perhaps to, you know, lay the basis for more discussion that's coming in the next few months. We'll be having this discussion at meetingoftheminds.org over the course of the next several months leading up to our annual leadership summit in October in Cleveland. One of the reasons we chose Cleveland is that there's some microgrid development underway. Companies like Eaton Corporation and Schneider Electric and Siemens are all very actively developing microgrids. And we want to be able in this discussion to look at some of the success stories. But before I ask you to maybe pick your favorite success story of a microgrid that's working really well, given the challenges that you've described, I want to talk for a moment about the challenges. So you've listed several, and I'll just list here 3 or 4 of them. One of them, of course, is the financial engineering challenge. You laid out really well where those come from and how they can be addressed. You talked about the community and citizen engagement piece so that the consumer or prosumer is actively engaged. You've talked about the multiple actors challenge, coordinating various parties, public sector, private sector, even the independent sector, since if it's a campus-based microgrid, it's not a for-profit, it's not a nonprofit, it could be a university or a hospital. So I guess my question is, given those challenges, what, you know, one most important ingredient would you want everybody to leave this discussion with when they think about busting the barriers? How to get past those obstacles in developing a microgrid, and maybe you can use this this other question that's emerged, which is picking a specific example of one microgrid project that worked really well or is currently working really well, and maybe identify how they overcame that barrier or 2 barriers or 3 barriers that you identified in this discussion. So let's start with that kind of 2-pronged question. Barrier busting, key ingredients, and maybe an example where it worked, it's working really well.
It's not an easy question to answer. Answering the last one first in terms of where it's working really well. I'll get to that first, and then we'll talk about some of what I guess I view as the most important keys to breaking down some of the barriers. Microgrids are a relatively new technology. I mean, it's depending on who you ask. Some people say they've been around for 20 years, but when we're talking about community microgrids that serve multiple customers and cross public rights of way, that's a pretty novel thing, at least in the United States and in most countries where there is a franchised utility kind of construct. And so as a result, there are not many examples to point to of community microgrids that have been built at all, much less to say they're examples that are, you know, the template. We're working on the template. We're really trying to create that model today. We're drawing upon templates that have been applied in other environments and in other types of investments. So it's not entirely a novel approach, but with regard to community microgrids, the examples that are out there don't really exemplify necessarily what we think about as a community microgrid for the future. But I will talk about some specific examples and talk about why they're important. One is the Borrego Springs microgrid in Southern California. San Diego Gas and Electric installed a microgrid around a specific substation because the community was kind of at the long end of a fairly unreliable transmission line. And in order to improve the reliability of service in that community, the utility ultimately was doing a research and development project in the beginning to see how technology could be brought in to use local energy resources to maintain better reliability in the community. That was a successful project, and San Diego Gas and Electric is expanding upon it now, increasing the amount of customers that are affected by it or improved by it, and expanding the solar energy in particular to serve that microgrid. So that's one example of how it works from at least from a technology perspective in a community environment. But in that case, it's owned and operated by the utility, and ultimately that was possible because it was seen as a cost-effective alternative to either increasing the size of the transmission line or taking some other approach to improve resiliency and reliability in the community. That is a fairly limited example that might not be super replicable in a lot of other locations. Another example that I like to point to is it's called, suddenly I'm losing the name of the microgrid. It's a co-op, a housing cooperative in the Bronx in New York. And in this housing cooperative, there's multiple apartment buildings and also commercial buildings, and it's owned by a single property owner, but it's got upwards of, I think, 50,000 residents. So it's actually a community unto itself, but it's privately owned. And that co-op serves as a good example of one approach to a microgrid, where basically it is relying on a large gas-fired power plant that is large enough to supply that community's energy needs and more. So basically, what it generates above and beyond what the microgrid requires, it exports into the local wholesale energy market in order to raise wholesale profit. So really, the microgrid itself is added on to the business case of an independent power generating plant. So that's another approach that really looks upon the generation as a revenue-producing asset and uses that to support the business case for a microgrid. If the power plant were off on its own, just selling wholesale power, it may be cost-effective, but it's made more cost-effective by being able to meet the retail power requirements of the residents in that co-op, in that housing co-op. And I just remembered it's called Co-op City in the Bronx, so that's something you can look up.
Yes, it's very, very famous facility, and they've been through a lot of evolution in Co-op City over the last 6 decades. I used to be able to see it from the bridge when I went over the bridge. So you spoke of communities, multiple actors in these communities. So in your experience and in the work that Microgrid Institute is doing, what types of institutions are the most difficult or the most helpful actors? For instance, the incumbent traditional utility. In a case like Borrego Springs, what was the view of the incumbent traditional utility? Did they resist or did they engage?
Well, it would probably be smart to ask them about their perspective on that project. I can't really speak for them. But my understanding is they were very engaged in the project. They viewed it as a research and development effort. They viewed it as a logical capital investment for the company to improve the reliability of service for those customers. So also a good investment on behalf of those customers. I think in that case, the utility was a driving force in that microgrid. There are other examples. We work closely with Pepco in Maryland on the Olney Town Center project that I mentioned. Pepco is very interested in developing microgrids as part of an overall grid modernization strategy that Pepco has been pursuing. And they are working with the county in selecting a couple of sites for microgrids that will be developed in their service territory in Maryland. I believe the only site actually was on that short list. Whether it comes out of that process, I don't know. But at any rate, they are interested and continue to be involved. We see that there's a kind of broad range of utility participation in microgrids, as you're kind of implying, that some of them definitely are supportive and interested in microgrids as a logical technology that can be applied in certain situations to more cost effectively serve customers. But they don't necessarily, we've seen that utilities in many cases aren't necessarily supporting microgrids for some of the same reasons that they aren't supporting rooftop solar, for example. Or they may do what they have to do to support it, but they're not enthusiastic about it. They're not really encouraging or trying to necessarily advance the adoption of rooftop solar, for example. And the same reasons apply to microgrids, because ultimately you're talking about using local generation resources to displace grid supplied power. And so from a utility's point of view, that can be viewed as a loss of load or a loss of customers, and loss of sales to customers, that is. So where that's the case, then there's can be an uneasy relationship with utilities. But what we've definitely found is that states and communities really carry quite a bit of weight, and what they want to see happen can convince utilities to come on board and to support these kinds of initiatives. Also, what we've seen in developing countries is that utilities tend to be going through kind of a process of learning about the next stage of technology evolution, and they're kind of coming up to speed in some locations with how to deploy renewables throughout a grid system, or how to expand a utility system to reach more customers using the latest advanced technologies. So in some developing countries, it seems like utilities are more favorably disposed toward microgrids. In other countries, they see them as very much a competing resource. In particular, if you're in an island where there is one small energy system owned by a public utility, then that public utility has very little leeway, very little room to give up customer load or sales. Their financial stability depends on maintaining the cash flow they already have. So they view other alternatives and self-supply alternatives of any kind as being a real problem from a financial perspective. We are starting, I think, now to get over the technical resistance to microgrids. We had seen for quite a while, especially in the utility distribution engineering space, that utility engineers tend to view microgrids as a problem to be avoided or to be mitigated, as opposed to a tool that can be used to support the utility system. We're starting to see that change as some utilities have more experience with it, and they learn from the experience of other utilities to integrate distributed resources to improve local resiliency, as opposed to just viewing it as kind of a problem or an issue, an engineering issue that needs to be solved. Certainly there are engineering issues, and I don't mean to imply that that they're making something up. There is the need for safety. There is the need for the ability to manage voltage and frequency on the grid. And it's really important that if a microgrid is feeding power onto the grid, that it's a good neighbor, that it's a very positive contributor to the grid, that's controllable by the utility and doesn't have unintended effects on the grid. So hope that answers it.
This is helpful. Thank you. So give us a very quick summary in the last minute and a half that we have about your assessment of what's happening with microgrids in Europe and also in Asia. Some people have asked about Singapore. Do you know of any that are happening, or is it happening more or less though than North America?
I think that the global market in some ways has been ahead of the U.S. market in microgrid development, but only in certain types of locations. The majority of the microgrid development that's happening in the U.S. is focused around commercial and industrial applications, government applications, and now community microgrid development. I think that's those particular sectors. The U.S. has been ahead and is still ahead of much of the world in terms of microgrid development. However, we are seeing pretty rapid advancements, particularly in locations where they have reliability issues and where there are threats to grid systems from hurricanes or from other natural threats, or where grid systems just aren't adequate to support remote villages, for example, or areas that have limited or zero electrification. So we can expect, I think, to see a leapfrog effect, where in the developing world in particular, microgrids will be adopted over the next 5 or 10 years pretty rapidly in many different locations around the world. What we're seeing really is starting to, the types of microgrids that have been developed in the US that are commercial and industrial and government oriented, we're starting to see those being developed in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. And that's starting to advance utility experience with microgrids in those locations. But the challenge tends to be that if the local customer is saying it has to either meet or be cheaper than the other available energy supplies, then a microgrid may not be always the cheapest solution. So on a pure economic basis, we're not seeing microgrids being rolled out really quickly all around the world, but instead where there are resilience requirements and where there's electrification needs in a community in a developing country, that's where we see it really advancing the most quickly.
Well, Michael, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for staying with us. That was a very rich and frankly worth revisiting webinar presentation. We're going to post one link from LBL, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, about the Borrego Springs project so that those who are hearing about it from you can learn more. We'll also, of course, point people to microgridinstitute.org, your own organization's website. We'll ask people to come back to worldsmartcity.org to look for more details, not just on our Facebook page, not just on our Twitter feed, but on the website itself so that they can get more in-depth detail over the coming months, especially about the standards piece that we didn't really get to talk much about, but how the adoption of global open secure standards by utilities and by non-utility developers of microgrids is going to help accelerate the transition to a microgrid decentralized future, particularly community microgrids, which I think is where we want to emphasize the discussion, because community microgrids are more likely to promote the sustainability of their communities. They're more likely to promote the resiliency of those cities. That's the big takeaway I take from what you've said, is that those kinds of public-private partnerships are worth doing. It's worth going through the hassle and the trouble when the outcomes are really big positive outcomes for that community, because this is not an easy process to build a microgrid, but when it happens, it should have multiple effects that are positive, and that means getting down to the nitty-gritty about renewables, about the sustainability of those energy supplies and the distribution of those energy solutions. So thank you again, Michael. Thank you, Sylvia, for producing this event. Thank you to the World Smart City Forum and to the 3 organizations who are based in Geneva that make this possible. And we encourage everybody to stay in touch with us and let us know how we can help you. We'll be planning another Hangout like this for coming weeks, and check back on our website to find those details. So thanks again to everybody, and we'll sign off now.
Thank
See
you
you soon. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.